From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health. And now here is our host and producer, Hilda Labrada Gore.
Hey, Hilda here. Many of us were on lockdown in 2020. We didn't go to the hospital unless it was an emergency. So we had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. That was 5 years ago. So why are we revisiting what happened then today? This is episode 518, and our guest today is Ken McCarthy. He is a citizen journalist and the author of What the Nurses Saw. He invites us to study history to avoid repeating it and what he calls the perversion of medicine that took place at that time. Ken describes the issues that came up during the so-called pandemic on today's episode. He reveals the systemic issues in patient care, from unethical changes in the standards of care to the unprepared staff and unhelpful hospital hierarchy that included charges for the uses of ventilators, COVID-related deaths, supposedly, and other issues. He especially focuses on conversations he had with nurses who were in the trenches and saw what was going on, and how anyone who dared to question the mainstream narrative was ostracized and even put their own license in jeopardy. Before we get into the conversation,
Today's guest expresses some views that the Weston A. Price Foundation does not share. When it comes to viruses, the foundation holds that there is no proof of the existence of viruses, and therefore we need to look elsewhere for the cause of disease, such as malnutrition and toxins.
I want to tell you that it is the 25th anniversary of the Weston A. Price Foundation, and as such, we're having a big celebration. We are giving away prizes to people who become members this year. Just go to westonaprice.org and click on the Become a Member button, or just click on the button that I'm going to put in the show notes. And join us for only $30 a year. It is the best deal around. You save $10 when you use the code POD10. So it's only $30 for the year. You support our wonderful and important work of education, research, and activism. So thank you for joining hands with us. You might just win a little something special as you do so. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Ken.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. You wrote that very kind of riveting book. It's almost read like a horror novel, actually, if people picked it up, called What the Nurses Saw. And I wondered if we could kick off this conversation with a story from one of the nurses. I like that you did that kind of Q&A style with the nurses. What is a story that really kind of shocked you into realizing that this story needed to be told?
Okay. First thing I learned that somebody else wrote another book with that title. So make sure when you're searching that it's the Ken McCarthy version. And I also want to tell people there's a website, whatthenursessaw.com, that you can follow up on anything that we talk about today. Oh, it was, people that have read the book know it was and continues to be on a lesser scale, but still continues to be an absolute horror show. Yeah, one of the most horrifying stories I heard, and there's so many, a young man came into a New York City public hospital in his 30s, healthy. He was having a panic attack. Now, why was he having a panic attack? Because he'd been bombarded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with terror about this dreaded disease that if you even looked at the wrong person the wrong way, you would die. And he took that to heart. And apparently, so he walked into this hospital with a breathing panic attack, and they gave him a COVID test, and they designated him a COVID patient. They intubated him, as quickly as possible, which is not normal medical procedure, and they killed him. Perfectly healthy guy, did not need to be intubated. Intubated is basically sticking the pipes down somebody's throat. Mm-hmm. And it's a very invasive procedure, very dangerous under the best of circumstances, likely to kill you. Last resort, during COVID, they were putting everybody they could on a ventilator. And this young man had no business being on a ventilator. He just needed someone to speak kindly to him and help him calm down. and he
Oh my
died.
goodness.
And we can multiply stories like that by tens, it's possibly hundreds of thousands, not necessarily people with panic attacks, but people who had no business being on a ventilation, who died as a result of the ventilation and the drugs they were given and so on.
Yeah, so putting people on ventilators, giving them remdesivir and different treatments like this, some might say, well, they were well intentioned. They were initially thought to be life-saving. What's your take on it?
Well, I can't blame anybody in the first early days or even weeks. They're doctors and nurses, and they were told this is the disease, this is the nature of the disease, and this is the treatment that we deem works. So they applied the treatment. But very quickly, to experienced nurses and experienced doctors, it was obvious these treatments were injuring and killing people, not helping. So after the first couple of weeks, anybody that continued to participate in it was engaged in something very sinister that they're going to have to deal with on their conscience level.
And I think that was the most troubling bit for the nurses. From what I read of the book, and I do have it right here, what the nurses saw, is that some of the nurses were doing their best, obviously, to help the patients, but they saw that something in the hierarchy of the hospital or some of the treatment modalities were not serving the patients well. And yet, even though the nurses wanted to sound the alarm bells, they were ignored.
Yeah, and we have to get the percentages here. So the most horrifying thing of this, and I looked at a lot of horror, and I couldn't, well, you'll see in a second. So I asked one of the nurses, what percentage of the nurses fought back? And they didn't answer. One of them didn't answer. And I said, was it less than 10%? And she said, yeah, way less than 10%. So when we're talking about the nurses, we're not talking about the majority of the nurses who fought back. We're talking about a very small minority. I don't even want to know how small the percentage is. I personally can't face that horror myself. So I'll just take it as less than 10%, but it was less than 10%. Less than 10% of the nurses were willing to say, hey, this is injuring the patient. I have an ethical responsibility to speak for the patient, because that is one of the professional requirements of being a nurse. You are the patient's advocate. It's not a touchy-feely thing. It's right in your training. It's right in your oath. They are our last line of defense, because doctors make mistakes. Doctors can be abusive. Yes, they can. And you need somebody to step in there and go, no, doctor, we already gave this guy an insulin shot 5 minutes ago. I know you're distracted and you want to give him another one. Let's not kill him. People make honest mistakes, and then people make other kinds of, quote, mistakes. And we really need the nurses there to step up.
And why do you think that percentage was so low, Ken?
Two things. Number one, remember, they had special COVID wards, right? This is a fundamental thing we have to remember. And we really need to remember this stuff. We should never forget what happened, because it could happen again. They could put the key in, turn the engine, and start a whole nother, I'm going to call it, mass murder system. And the book documents pretty clearly that that's what it was. So one of the problems was, if you got a positive COVID test, and they believed they would test you over and over and over again until they got a positive test, you went into an alternate medical and legal reality. Okay. And you were put on a COVID floor or a COVID ward, where all the normal laws of medicine, or not laws, but just medical experience, decades, centuries even of medical experience, went out the window. All laws of science went out the window. All laws of common sense went out the window. And all those laws of basic human decency went out the window. Now, who staffed these special COVID wards? Well, some of our nurses in the book were contract nurses, and they went up. Their initial idea was, we're going to help out. They thought initially that they were going into basically battle that they may not survive. Right? Remember, that's how it was presented. If you get this, you're a goner. And it's the most transmissible disease that ever lived. If somebody's walking 10 miles away and a particle could flow, I mean, literally, this was the nonsense science they were selling us. So they were going into danger.
Yes.
However, the laws were changed in New York State. I don't know every single state, but in New York State, suddenly, if you were a foreign doctor you could just get on a plane, come to the United States, and practice medicine in a COVID ward. Now, if anybody's a doctor listening to this, you know that that's not how it works. If you could be the greatest, let's say, orthopedic surgeon in Germany, the whole world comes to study with you. If you come to the United States, you qualify to be a janitor in a hospital until you jump through 10,000 hoops to practice medicine in the United States. They threw those laws out during COVID. So we had guys coming from God knows where who could literally barely speak English. I'm not sure they were all verified as being doctors. I mean, at this point, I don't know what was going on. And they were putting the COVID wards in charge of these patients. We also had nurses who not only were completely green, had no ICU experience at all. Some of them had not yet graduated from nursing school, let alone had any practical experience. These were the people that were put in charge of COVID patients in the New York City public hospitals with predictable results.
Do you think?
And so they didn't know. So that's to answer your question.
Yes.
They didn't know which end was up. They were just do this, and they were paid very well. The nurses in the New York City were paid $10,000 a week. That money came from Homeland Security. It was filtered through these human brokerage companies. There's a better term for it, jobbers, whatever. And by the way, if the nurses were making 10,000, the guy putting the nurses on the job was making at least 5 and maybe 10 himself. Multiply that by hundreds. Somebody, I'm not a professional journalist, I'm not an investigative reporter. I'm just a guy that was really concerned. Somebody needs to find out who owned those human resource contracting companies and what those people's connections were to various government people, because I'm telling you, millions and millions of dollars were made. So basically you had a flood of unqualified medical people thrown into the ICUs, put in charge of patients. So that's one of the reasons nurses didn't stand up.
Yeah. So ignorance, maybe.
Ignorance, and if the nurse, and then doctors didn't stand. By the way, doctors were less likely to stand up. Nurses, as a percentage, were way more likely to say no. I think nurses, nurses are, they're a little tougher. They don't have huge overheads that they've built for themselves. And they're kind of blue collar mentality that I go to work, I do a job, I go home. And if I can't work here, I can work somewhere else. Doctors, it's a little different. It's a little different. They're a little more afraid of losing their licenses. So the other reason nurses didn't stand up is if you did stand up, you were chastised, to say the least.
Yes.
You'd be taken out of if you were one of our nurses, right? Airlift kind of nurse, like air ambulance. So there's a plane wreck in the mountains, let's say. Helicopter, the only way to reach them is a helicopter. You can't fit much medical equipment on a helicopter. Severe trauma. This is the kind of job this nurse would go on. Like, she worked in refugee camps in Syria. I mean, this was like all pro trauma nurse.
Yes.
When she spoke up about remdesivir, she was taken out of the ICU and put basically in a room with a bunch of other nurses who'd also spoke up about the ICU, still getting paid and having nothing to do but fold towels.
Oh.
So that was the lowest level of punishment. The next level of punishment was being fired. The next level of punishment was an organization of trolls being set upon you personally to dox you, which means giving out your home address, and inflaming a bunch of lunatics to start harassing you. The next level of punishment was to have these same people filing complaints against you at your local nursing board, trying to get your nursing license taken away. So it got so bad for one of our nurses that strangers, and she lived way out in the countryside when she went home. I mean, she's rural, beyond rural, right? 3 hours from the nearest small town. She had people showing up at her door, right? So the level of harassment against anyone that dared to stand up was massive.
Wow.
And, not only did these nurses have to witness people being essentially killed and not being able to stop it, they were harassed and coerced. There's a nurse group up in Canada. The abuse the Canadian government has dropped on these nurses is unbelievable. Like the atom bomb of legal assault on these good women who are only trying to do the right thing and save their patients. It's one of the most despicable episodes of medical history.
Let's back up for a minute.
Sure.
I want to hear more of the nurses' stories, but I also want to hear, how did you become interested as just a regular Joe? You said you weren't an investigative journalist. How did you become interested in helping their story be told and their voices be heard?
Well, like many people, I've had, I'm going to be 65 soon. I've had plenty of experience with the medical profession, and through myself and through family members and through friends. And I've seen many atrocities, and I experienced one myself personally. So I am not a cheerleader for the way our medical system works. Let's put it that way. Number two, I've been aware of the perversion of medicine for a long time. I studied neuroscience at Princeton in the 70s as an undergraduate. And I remember, I'll never forget, our professor, Bart Hobel, the guy that he charted the dopamine pathway of the human brain, not a lightweight, once took a whole class to say, look, I got pharma companies knocking on my door all day wanting to develop products around the science we're developing. And I want to tell you guys, this was 79. I want to tell you guys, do not participate in this. Okay. We're learning things about the brain. And one of the things we're learning is, yes, you can alter brain chemistry. Do not do it lightly, because there's no going back once you start. And so I had that in my brain, and I do kind of know the science. I didn't go into that field, but I did get trained in it. And then when I saw the kids being, oh, here's some Adderall, here's this, here's that. And I looked at the ingredients. I'm like, Adderall is 4 different kinds of amphetamines.
Mm.
And I was horrified, and I realized, wow, pharma has become beyond evil. And then, of course, you're aware, you visit and you see children that have been injured by vaccines, and the fact, that the parents were left high and dry and slandered and gaslit. So not a fan of the system as the way it works. So when I saw COVID come, I smelled a rat. And my Twitter channel is still frozen by X or Twitter or whatever they call it now, but it's still live for some bizarre reason. So you can go to my Twitter channel, Ken McCarthy. You can go to my February 1st, 2020 post. This is when it was in China and hadn't even made it to Italy. I said, this is a vaccine marketing exercise. They're going to try to develop a coronavirus, and they're going to use more speed than science. I saw this coming a mile away, because I know the science and I know a lot about marketing, and I'm a student of the history of propaganda. So to me, this was just blatantly obvious. So I started writing, trying to wake people up. So that's how I got to it. But I didn't understand the significance of what had happened in the hospitals until the summer of 2023. I had interviewed some of the nurses in 2020 because I'd seen them on the media, and there were a lot of questions I had, and I wanted better answers. So I booked 2 long interviews, one with Aaron Olszewski, easier called Nurse Aaron, and then another with a wonderful nurse, PhD, professor, educator, 40 years of experience in the UK. And I got those interviews done, and I thought, wow, this is a heck of a story. I can't wait to read articles about it someday by professional journalists, and maybe a book will come out. And so 2020 passed, 2021 passed, 2022 passed. It's the middle of 2023, and I realized nobody's going to write about this. I better do it. So with my initial leads, I interviewed a whole bunch of other nurses, a respiratory therapist, and then a forensic accountant. And that's what's in the book.
Yes.
So that's how it came to be.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I also got to interview some of the nurses. I think it was at the March Against Mandates at one point. I met some of them downtown, and their stories are so compelling. So I'll put a link in this show episode description so people can find that and hear from the nurses themselves. But in the meantime, I want to go back to something you said. You saw the perversion of medicine and obviously issues in the healthcare, or rather we should call it the sick care system, right?
Yeah.
Talk to us about what the agencies like HHS and NIH and so forth had to do with what was going on in the hospitals during the time of COVID.
Okay. Bottom line, they incentivized a whole bunch of treatments that made no medical, scientific, or ethical sense. For example, and everybody hears about ivermectin. It was bland, and that was a big deal. But that was smoke and mirrors. They also banned ibuprofen for COVID patients. They also banned inhalable steroids for COVID patients. Okay, that made no medical sense. That flew in the face of all medical practice. If you have an inflammatory problem with your lungs. First thing you do is you knock that inflammation down. Second thing you do is you get some steroids to help you. Okay. Never in the history of modern medicine have people come to the hospital with a respiratory problem and been told they couldn't get anti-inflammatories and they couldn't get steroids.
Ah,
Okay. I didn't know this until I started researching the book.
right.
So that was step one. This is the equivalent of a fire engine arriving at a house on fire, and the firemen just are told, stand back. We needed to burn a lot more. I mean, this is what they did. This was the protocol, and God help you if you didn't follow the protocol.
Coming up, Ken addresses whether hospitals really were overflowing during the time of COVID.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Optimal Carnivore. The guys at Optimal Carnivore know that organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. But they also know that they can be hard to source and not always easy to make tasty. So they've gone to great lengths to try to get them available to us. They've started sourcing 100% grass-fed organ meats from New Zealand. They freeze-dry the organs and encapsulate them into convenient bovine gelatin capsules. And they chose New Zealand because it is a pure source with rich soil, lush greenery, and one of the cleanest environments on the planet. Optimal Carnivore's products are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished and free from hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. And since our ancestors would have eaten the whole animal, Optimal Carnivore has created a unique blend of 9 different organs in the grass-fed organ complex. It is a powerful combination, including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, and gallbladder. It is a real nose-to-tail solution. And of course, each nutrient has its own special properties that support all of the major organs and glands in your body. Again, by gently freeze-drying the nutrients, by the way, they're preserving vitamins, minerals, proteins, and enzymes that make these the best bang for your buck. These are perfect for whether you're traveling or on the go. So go to Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and place your order today. They have the grass-fed organ complex, a grass-fed bone marrow, a grass-fed liver product, brain nourish, and more. Again, that's Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore, and use the code WESTON10 to get a 10% discount on all products. Again, that's Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and the code WESTON10. Black Lotus Shilajit. Are you tired of the same old low-quality Shilajit? Black Lotus Shilajit is here to revolutionize your wellness routine. They are committed to purity, transparency, and affordability. And their unique processing method, using only water and sunlight, preserves the potency of their Shilajit. Unlike that sourced from polluted Himalayan regions, they provide pure product. Black Lotus Shilajit is a family-run business also, with 20 years of experience in holistic health. Their quality shines through in every bottle. From the fully transparent lab testing to their sustainable packaging. They're setting a new standard, so don't settle for less. Choose Black Lotus Shilajit. It's time to experience the true power of nature. Head over to blacklotusshilajit.com and enter the code WISE to get 15% off your order. Again, that's blacklotusshilajit.com and the code WISE for 15% off your order. This is Hoda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions.
The next protocol, and this is a trick they use in the hospital all the time, and I want to warn everybody about it. Be very careful about taking any psychoactive medications offered to you when you're in a hospital. They say, well, do you need something to relax? Do you need something for your nerves? Do you need something? I mean, painkiller, I get it, okay? Mm-hmm. But that other class of drugs, why is this dangerous? Because they can then say this person is a danger to themselves and others, and they agree to psychiatric medication, and now it's harder to get you out of the hospital. And believe me, many people's lives were saved because they got out of the COVID hospital. And that's going on even to this day.
Because we were told to stay away, from the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
So afraid of the supposed virus, it made it hard to know what was true anymore. I don't know if you saw the footage of some people saying the hospital wards are actually not overflowing. We're not struggling with an influx of patients, but the media was certainly painting it that way. What did the nurses see in terms of the influx of patients?
Well, for instance, let's take Aaron. She's a great hero of all this, right? She was the first person. She had a spokesperson speak for her. She stayed behind the lines, tried to save lives, and documented everything, which was hard. I mean, that was like being in battle. That was like deliberately saying, okay, there's a battle. I could walk away. I'm going to stay in it. So the reason that Erin went from Florida to New York, she wanted to help. She had the skills. There was no work in Florida. They had closed everything down and there was nothing. There were minimal COVID patients. By the way, I asked her, how many COVID patients survived that you saw in Florida, in her region, in her area? All but one. How many survived in the New York City run hospital where you were sent as a contractor? None. Zero. They all died versus one person. And the person that maybe, this whole thing of died of COVID, it's like, well, they were in stage 4 of cancer. They had a very bad diabetes. They, blah, 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 blah. And they died of COVID. So even maybe that person in Florida that died did not die of COVID. So anyway, it was a fraud that hospitals were slammed. Now, the COVID wards might have been slammed, but the actual normal hospitals, there was nothing to do.
Right. Well, it's so interesting. And I'm sorry I'm interrupting you. I'm getting excited because I remember that you were talking about incentives. The hospitals were incentivized.
Yes, this is very important.
Deaths as COVID because they would get more money than if they said it was a regular cancer death or, and I mean, I have a personal story. A family member of mine had a stroke and other comorbidities, if you will, issues with a hernia and liver function, and she passed and they labeled it as COVID. And I'm only laughing because it's so absurd, but that's what the hospital was doing because they were incentivized to do so.
This is so important. I'm glad you brought up the incentivization. So how did this happen? The hospitals were paid big money to do this. Number one, they were said, follow the protocol. So what else did the protocol include? So we talked about the denial of basic anti-inflammatories and basic steroids, which is just normal medicine. We're not talking about some alternative thing that somebody pulled out of thin air. We're talking about how you treat respiratory, right? Then many of the patients were put on psychoactive meds, tranquilizers, what does a tranquilizer do to your breathing? Reduces your ability to breathe because you breathe with a muscle. It's kind of a complicated thing, even though it's quite simple. It seems simple when you do anatomy, but it's actually the diaphragm is what allows you to breathe. And it is essentially a muscle. And if you're drunk or on heroin or, on opioid or on a tranquilizer, your breathing capacity diminishes. So they put people on drugs that they knew would diminish breathing capacity. The next thing they did was say, hey, you know what? You're not doing too well. Let's put BiPAP on you. All right. That is a form of venting, but it's non-invasive. And it's basically a mask tied really tightly around your head, and they just pump air down your lungs. It is the equivalent of you're driving a car at 80 miles an hour, and as a passenger, you stick your head out the window, and that's how fast now, normally when you treat somebody with a machine, first of all, that is not the first thing you do with people. It's like a gradation. We tried this, it didn't work. We tried this, it didn't work. We tried this, it didn't work. They're really in trouble. Let's do the BiPAP. Normally, you tell people, hey, it's intense. Mm-hmm. You might feel fear. We're going to be here. We're going to take care of you. And if you're worried, we're here. That's not how they did it during COVID. They would just slap this thing on people, not explain to people how incredibly uncomfortable it was, and then leave them alone in a room. So a lot of people would go into panic. I would. I'm in a hospital. I think I'm dying. I've got this thing on. No one's explained it to me. I'm alone in a room. I'll panic. More psychoactive drugs come out. Okay. Then the next thing, well, they're all woozy and don't know what's going on. And by the way, could their loved ones be there to look out for them? Nope. Could their doctor look out for them? Nope. Could their lawyer look out for them? Nope. They were alone.
Yeah.
The next thing, now that they're in a woozy state, hey, we got a cure for you. It's called remdesivir. Now, nobody knew what remdesivir was. Nobody knew it was a failed Ebola drug. Nobody knew one of the side effects of Ebola was your organs basically disintegrating rapidly. Well, it turns out that a lot of people, remember, I don't know if people remember, but in the very early days, they said, this virus is unbelievable. It causes incredible organ damage. Well, that was the people that were given remdesivir. Remdesivir was so, not good for human beings that they stopped giving it to Ebola patients, but they revived it for COVID. And they paid the hospitals to administer it. It's administered via a bag and a drip, and it goes into your arm, right? You got paid, the hospitals got paid for every course. Now, a course is multiple bags of this poison.
Mm.
They got paid for every course. And we know of one case where a patient was given 5 courses of remdesivir, and every time the cash register rang. Yeah. The condition, after I wrote, I could almost weep.
Yes.
The condition, after I wrote the book, I met with a group of families because I hadn't talked to anybody that had a loved one die. Some of these people were virtually liquefied. Their bodies were absolutely destroyed. That wasn't COVID. That was the drugs, right? So they were paid for every course of COVID. One of our nurses, Nicole, she said, this is the air nurse that, like Top Gun, trauma nurse, right? Mm-hmm. She said, I'm not giving anybody any more of this stuff. I see what it's doing to people. And that's what got her kicked out. Mm-hmm. And she's the one that had people showing up at her door out in rural Nevada. And you don't know rural until you've seen rural Nevada. Right? That's rural, right?
Yeah.
So the next level of incentivization was the vents. Now, we have an interview with a respiratory therapist. Okay. He's the guy, because venting is dangerous. Mm-hmm. People die on vents. It's the last thing you want to do. You don't do it lightly. Now, if you're dying, and you can't breathe and you literally can't breathe, but they would have people walk across the room, get on the phone and tell their loved one, they're going to put me on a vent now. If you can walk across a room and talk to somebody on the phone, you don't need to be on a vent.
Wow.
But they were paying people to put them on vents, and they were paying them a 5-figure fee. And here's the really sinister thing. When you're on a vent, an ethical respiratory therapist and doctor and nursing team wants to get you off that vent as soon as possible, right? Because every day you're on a vent, and I'll explain what venting means. It's horrific. If you have to do it to save your life, okay. They incentivize the hospitals to keep people on vents for 90 hours plus. Okay, so the normal thing is you vent somebody, mm-hmm. you save their lives. Within 24 hours, you see if you can get them off. You see if they're strong enough to breathe. And every day you keep checking, Mm-hmm. They were incentivized to not check and just keep somebody on for 90 days or more. Now, let me explain what venting is.
Yeah, tell us more.
Okay. Remember, I said you have this diaphragm. It's a muscle. Now, you could be in a car accident or some horrific thing happens, and your diaphragm's not working. If your diaphragm's not working, you will be dead within minutes, okay? That's when you vent somebody. Mm-hmm. And thank God we have this technology and we have capable people, doctors, nurses, and respiratory therapists that know how to do this. But you only do it then. Okay, here's what venting means. You take a pipe, they call it the garden hose, because it's big, and you jam it down somebody's throat all the way into, down there, all the way down. Then you got to give them a feeding tube all the way down. Okay, there is a danger, even if you do it right, of injuring somebody doing that. As you can imagine, we're not built to have pipes put down on it. If you have to do it to save lives, okay. To save a life, okay. It's a balance, right? Now, to get that pipe down your throat, they have to give you a lot of drugs. One of the drugs they have to give you are the analgesics. Mm-hmm. One of the analgesics they give you is fentanyl, okay? You also need to be given antiparalytics. What's an antiparalytic? It keeps you from thrashing around, because even unconscious, if you stick a pipe down somebody's throat, your body's going to move. So they have to paralyze you with drugs, and then they have to knock you out. And we're not talking about giving you a pill or one injection. You have a line of drips in your arm that are permanent hanging bags for the whole time you're on an event. And one of the jobs of the nurses is to come and change the bag. And you got to watch these patients very carefully, because these drugs are toxic. So what did they do during COVID? They had the bags and the racks out in the hallways so that the nurses wouldn't even go in and see the condition of the patient, because it was too dangerous to go in.
You mean the lines were so long that the
could just they engineered it. They
evaluate it from the outside. Oh, no.
They didn't evaluate anything. They just changed the bags when the bag was empty. They put a new bag in.
Oh,
these patients. I'm not even going to get into the condition some of these patients were in.
Oh, no.
I know. I hate to. I'm not. I'm
It's a
usually a
lot.
cheerful kind of fun guy, but this is the reality of what happened.
No, I understand. And I think it's helpful for us. And again, we'll put a link in the show description, not only to my interview with the nurses, but also to your book and your website so people can find more resources. But I have to ask you, are there people, Ken, who say, oh my gosh, this was 2020. Like, I don't know why we're bringing up all this old news right now. Let's just kind of move on and, make the best of life as it is. What do you say to the
This is
skeptic
good.
who
This
thinks
is
this
this is
is
a
old
really good
news?
point. I'm going to tell you right now, anytime you're hospitalized, you better have somebody watching your back, not just COVID. Okay. And one of the things we get into the book, and it's on the website too, there's a new industry called medical advocacy. If you find yourself with a legal problem, like a civil problem or a criminal problem, you better get an attorney. You don't want to go facing a judge and trying to figure it out on the fly. You are in a hospital, in my opinion, you better call a medical advocacy company and get them on the job watching your back. So that's why, and so that's number one. Number two, these protocols are still in place. If you're in the wrong hospital at the wrong time and you're the wrong person and they test you positive for COVID, they will run you through this same thing, the same gauntlet. Wow. And we are getting reports of people dying this way up till this moment. So this is not over. The scale and scope of it, and let me tell you about the scale and scope.
Yeah.
Roughly 1 million people, they say, died of COVID. 92% of them died in hospitals. We're talking about a inconceivably large number of people who were killed and or seriously injured. Some people survived. Mm-hmm. This is a lot of people we're talking about. And the machinery that did this is still in place and it does not have a scratch on it. Like I said earlier at the beginning of the call, they can put the key in, turn the engine, and do it all over again.
And I think in part it's still in place because, as you've alluded to this, there was censorship of anyone speaking out against the mainstream narrative, whether it was about treatments or the incentives. Like, there was hardly a peep about any of this, and they made sure it stayed that way. So even now we're just like, I guess it all worked out okay. They saved lives over there.
It didn't work out okay. And it revealed a grave, grave danger. So my advice to people is stay healthy, walk, follow Sally's advice on eating, get sunshine. We're not immortal, things are going to happen. If you find yourself in a hospital, everybody should do the research on what medical advocacy is, be aware of a medical advocate company and have it in your Rolodex for yourself and for your loved ones. And it's not free, but it's not super expensive. And you need a medical advocate just as much as you need an attorney, or, let's say you have a business, you need a tax attorney, whether you like it or not, you got to hire one. And it's kind of the same thing with medical advocacy. It's a fledgling industry, but I like the two people I know that are running the companies. They seem dedicated, and you need it. You need it. So that's my big advice to people: stay healthy and stay out of the hospital. I got to tell one other thing. I had a friend. He thought he had a heart attack, and they said, "Oh my God, it's good we got you. We got to operate on you tomorrow." And then then it turned out they didn't have any surgeons available and they didn't have any space available. They said, "Well, come back in 3 weeks." So it's like, which is it? It's so urgent, we have to do it right now, or now we can wait 3 weeks. These guys are really good at creating the scenario where you've got to act now on some really invasive thing. That's why you need a medical advocate.
Yeah, 100%. I have a friend who had like precancerous cells in her breast, and she did everything, Ken, like all the treatments and chemo and radiation. And I remember her husband saying, "I'm so glad we caught the precancerous cell." And I was like, like, was that a good idea? I'm not in their shoes, granted, but I think there's an overreach that happens, and we need to really be wise about what treatments we agree to.
They get paid when they do whatever the thing is they do. And, they've been told that what they're doing is great.
Yeah.
And they're just, they did a study. This is actually a study of oncologists in Canada. And they asked them, if you had cancer, would you do all the stuff that you're doing to patients? 80% of them said no. That's something we need to think about. Also, on the oncology side, oncologists get a kickback on the chemo, and it is lucrative. And unfortunately, a lot of people do what's in their best financial interest. It's their sort of reflex. And nobody in their circle is questioning them. In fact, were they to question what they're doing, a lot of people would come down on them very hard. So this is the reality. You know, we've got wonderful technology. We have some good doctors. We have some good nurses. I don't want to freak people out, but I want people to understand these people are not necessarily your friends. I mean, the other thing too, when you're in a hospital, you think, well, my doctor, my nurse, those people are not your doctor. Those people are not your nurse. They are employees of the hospital, first and foremost. You come, you go.
Right.
They're worried about their jobs.
You might go sooner than you'd like to go, so to speak. But so, Ken, you were talking about staying healthy. I love to pose this question at the end of the podcast to remind our listener that there are steps we can take to do so. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
I mean, this sounds like I'm shilling, but read Sally's books, for God's sake, and do what she says. I mean, here's the thing. We're here because our ancestors did something right. And they had really hard lives. They didn't have central air. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have somehow we made it.
Yep.
And they ate a very different kind of food than we ate. And all that food's available to us with a little bit of education. We've got to stay away from the processed foods.
Absolutely.
And we've got to look at what our great-grandparents ate. Now, sometimes if they lived in the city, maybe they didn't eat such good stuff. But if they were out in the countryside, they were eating very, very well. And you can still see this in the third world. That's what I loved about Sally's work. There are still places in the world that have not been destroyed where people still grow their own food. And those folks are as healthy as horses.
Absolutely.
I was in Morocco a couple of years ago, way back beyond the Atlas Mountains. Everybody thin, clear-eyed, healthy, walked everywhere. You know, the children were beautiful, friendly. You know, it was really, I mean, I knew that it was true, but it was one, you know, to see it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can live ancestrally today. Ken, thank you so much for this conversation on behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation. We are so grateful for your time.
Great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Our guest today was Ken McCarthy. Visit his website, whatthenursessaw.com, for more. And I am Hilda Labrada-Gore, the host and producer of this podcast on behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can find me at holistichilda.com. And for the transcript for this week's episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And thank you so much for listening, my friend. We would love for you to join hands with us as a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation in this, our 25th year. It is a big deal. And by joining hands with us, you become part of our whole movement to make the world healthy again, right? Again, we do education, research, and activism with your help. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a donor-supported organization. We need your support. So join us. Use the code POD10 when you go to westonaprice.org. Become a member. It's only $30 for the year, and thank you in advance. And thank you again for listening. Stay well, and remember to keep your feet on the ground and your face to the sun.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.